right? Today we find out, voter suppression notwithstanding, whether America is going to continue down the autocratic road. And by the way, David Leonhardt has a brilliant piece in the New York Times today about how this happened in Hungary. Whether we continue down the autocratic road that not only Donald Trump, but in fact, largely, I mean, this precedes Donald Trump. Mitch McConnell's been doing this for a long, long time. Whether we travel down this road toward plutocracy, autocracy, oligarchy, you know, kind of a combination of the three. That combination of the three back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, we called fascism. Whether we continue down that road or whether we slow it or whether we reverse it. And it's going to depend on whether you get out to the polls or whether you get your friends out to the polls, whether we all vote. I've voted. Have you? So, you know, today, we have one guest in the whole show today. He'll be on in about a half hour. He's with the DNC, and he's just going to give us an update on how everything's going around the country and what we can do. I did want to flag for you a couple of things. The first one is the phone number, which we're using this election, we've used in past elections. It's 866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE, 866-OUR-VOTE. And you call that only if you have a problem. That's the problem line, right? If you go in and your voting machine flips, for some reason we got reports from 4 states now that the voting machine, this is from early voting, I don't know, I'm assuming it's still continuing, that the voting machines are flipping votes. And, it's not happening a lot, apparently, but is happening. And weirdly, every single report that I've seen, maybe you've seen others. I mean, I don't so much read right-wing media anymore these days. And so maybe the flip side is being reported on there. But it seems that it's always flipping Democratic votes into Republican votes. You vote for Beto O'Rourke and it says, thank you for voting for Ted Cruz kind of thing, And in fact, Texas is one of the states where we're getting these reports about electronic voting machines flipping votes. And they always, this has been going on since 2002 when the Help America Vote Act, gave billions of dollars to the states to buy voting machines from Republican-aligned companies like ES&S and Diebold. And it always seems to work to the benefit of the Republicans. If Republicans win, it's going to depend. First of all, it's going to depend on turnout, obviously. But also, if they win, it's going to mean that their voter suppression efforts have been successful. This is a big deal. Greg Palast is writing about this over at Truthout. And in Greg's piece at Truthout today, he writes, this is specifically about Georgia. He says, purged voters' provisional ballots could decide the Georgia governor's race. Keep in mind, the last Georgia governor's race was won by about a little less than 200,000 votes. And Brian Kemp has purged he's purged about 500,000 people from the voting rolls in Georgia. But Greg Palast's lawsuit and research found that 340,134 of them actually still live in Georgia. He tells the story, for example, of a guy by the name of Rahim Shabazz. And Rahim Shabazz said, I wanted to vote for Stacey Abrams, but I won't be able to vote in the November 6th election. Why? Because Brian Kemp had canceled his voter registration. The reason Kemp did it, he said, was because Shabazz had not voted in the previous 2 elections. And Shabazz says, hey, wait a minute. You have a constitutional right to vote, and you have a constitutional right not to vote, right? He says he didn't like the choices that were offered in the last 2 elections. He also says that the government has no trouble finding him to pay parking tickets or pay his taxes. Why won't they let him vote? And so anyhow, he discovered this by going on Greg Palast's site and plugging his name into the database, the Georgia Purge database, and boom, there he was. He had been purged by Brian Kemp. And so he contacted the Secretary of State's office and said, hey, wait a minute, you purged me. I want to vote. And they said, sorry, it's too late. Voter registration is closed. You have to wait 2 more years. And this is going to be the case for 340,000 Georgia voters. Now, if they show up to the polls, and probably many of them will, because they don't know that they've been purged. There's been no notice sent out to any of these people. When they show up at the polls, they'll be given a provisional ballot, which will not be counted on election night. And if it is counted at all, The person who decides whether provisional ballots get counted is, drum roll, Brian Kemp, the guy running for governor against Stacey Abrams, the guy who's also the Secretary of State, who's running the election in which he is a candidate. So, keep your eyes out. I've got a bunch of stories here that we're going to dig into as we go through the show, but I'm declaring this an anything goes voting Tuesday here. If there's anything on your mind you want to talk about that you can figure out any way to relate it to the elections or electoral politics, feel free. I mean, it's not a day to discuss UFOs, certainly, but, issues, what plays, what doesn't, what works, what doesn't, anything like that, give us a shout. There was one thing, this is economics, and this doesn't have anything to do with voting, or maybe it does. In fact, maybe it's really at the core of it. Because this has to do, I think, with what's going to happen right after the election. We've been watching for 4 or 5 months now the worldwide economy cooling down. China's GDP has dropped to about 2%. You've got a bunch of countries in Europe that have already started to slide into recession. Russia's in recession. This is happening all over the country. Russia came up with an alternative program to SWIFT. Now, SWIFT is the program, the international banking program that clears international transactions. But they have to be done in dollars for it to work, or euros. And so Russia's come up with an alternative to this program where you can clear things in rubles internationally. And China, they're working with China to create this alternative payment system. And Chuck Miller, who writes the Daily Pfennig for the Aden sisters, the Aden forecast, he says, I read a report last night that Russia's alternative payment to SWIFT has already gained quite a few users. When trading partners of Russia and eventually China too, as they will use this alternative payment system, use this system and bypass SWIFT, it means they'll no longer need dollars to settle the terms of their trade. These are baby steps to that outcome, folks, but it's happening right before your eyes. Do you see it? And then he writes, and now this. The good news for the U.S. just keeps rolling in. Now, he's being sarcastic. I've told you about how central banks around the world have been backing away from their usual allotment of treasuries sold at the auction. Now, let me back away from Chuck for a moment. This is two things. Number one, the Republicans last year borrowed $1.5 trillion. It's a $5 trillion over 10 years. But just last year, it was $1.5 trillion that they borrowed to give to billionaires. And when the federal government borrows money, the way they borrow that money is they sell treasury bonds and bills into the public market and the international market. And if nobody buys those bills, nobody buys those debt instruments, those IOUs, if nobody gives the federal government the money so that they can hand it over to the billionaires as tax cuts, then the government has to offer higher interest rates to encourage people to buy the treasuries. You're following this? I mean, it's very simple stuff, right? Where the government says, hey, we're going to offer these, here's $1 trillion worth of bonds that will pay 2.3%. And the world says, we're not interested in 2.3%. We're not interested in your bonds. We don't need it right now. So the government says, well, how about 2.4%? Not yet. How about 2.5%? Okay, we'll take 2.5%. So that's how it works, right? So back to Chuck. He says, I've told you all about how central banks around the world have been backing away from their usual allotment of treasuries sold at auction. Well, yesterday we got the second worst bid to cover in 9 years of the auction of short-term treasuries. In other words, this goes back to the tail end of the recession when we did, we borrowed another $1 trillion. That was in 2009 or 2010, to fund the Recovery Act, to give money to billionaires and banks to bring the economy back. And he says, well, yesterday we had the second worst bid to cover in 9 years. Wait, what? Yes, the auction did not go off smoothly. He said, we've seen the yields rise, right? I mean, we're at 11-year highs on short rates, and the stock market is teetering. And all that isn't enough to attract more buyers at the auction? Uh-oh. And his point here is that, people want to invest their money. They want to make money with money. But they're not putting their money in the stock market right now because it's teetering, and they're not putting it in bonds. What the heck does that mean? That's a huge bad sign. So he says, apparently yields are going to have to rise much more. And we all know what that does to bond servicing costs. In other words, as yields rise, then the federal government has to pay more money, right? So, I mean, we're on course right now to be spending more on just paying interest on the national debt than we pay to the Pentagon. He says, this is scary to me, folks, and should be to you. And I'm not the boy who cried wolf. This is actually happening. And I absolutely agree with Chuck Miller. The Republican irresponsibility that we saw during the Bush administration and during the Trump administration, where Bush put 2 wars on the national credit card without paying for them and a $1 trillion tax cut on the national credit card without paying for it. And then this, bled into the Obama presidency, where he had to, that and Republican deregulation of the banking system brought about the great crash in 2008. And then Obama had to borrow another $1 trillion to get us out of that crash. And, we can still argue about how that should have been done, whether the money should have gone to people or whether it should have gone to banks and billionaires. But, it went to banks and billionaires. That's what it took to get Republicans in Congress to go along with something that would save the republic. So that's what they did. And here we are. And when the bottom starts to fall out in a way that's visible, because it's visible right now to a lot of us, the bottom is falling out. And it's going to become really obvious in the next 4 or 5 months. And when it does, guess what Donald Trump and the Republicans are going to say? It's because the Democrats just took the House and maybe the Senate. That's what they're going to say. And we've got to get ready for that. My answer, the Republicans say, Trump brought us this giant surge in the economy, and isn't that wonderful? And my answer is the same answer that I gave back in the 80s when Reagan did the same thing is, give me a $1 trillion credit card, and I'll show you what it looks like to live large. But the bill's going to come due someday. And I don't mean that in the context of some, Republican debt fear-mongering hysteria. The reality is that the Republican two Santa Claus theory, they're trying to run up the debt so much that the Democrats are going to have to say, okay, we go along. We say, uncle, yes, cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid to pay for that interest on the debt, to pay down the debt so we don't have to pay so much interest. That's the Republican game plan. That's what they're betting on. And they are betting with the future of this country and the economy, and the people who get hurt are not the billionaires. They make money whether the market goes up or down. It's going to be average working people all across this country. They're going to get wiped out because of this Republican irresponsibility, which they will blame on the Democrats.